of the time.
Hey guys, another video I'm making today. So, this video is more about me just waffling about Warhammer 40k. Now, again, like I said, I'm going to be out of town for a few days, so I had to make videos ahead of time. Now, if you don't know Warhammer 40k that much, the series originally was made in the 90s or the 80s. It's been around for quite a while. Now, the series originally started out as a sci-fi version of Warhammer Fantasy, or it was just called at the time Warhammer, and Warhammer 40k was just, again, a sci-fi version of that. Now, Warhammer Fantasy was a series made by a company called Games Workshop. Now, Games Workshop has had a lot of controversy in the past. Not for any, political stuff when it comes to, internal politics or being, involved in any controversies within the company. Not, stuff that happened with Justin Roiland from Rick and Morty, for example. Now, I mentioned that in my video yesterday, so this is more to do with the way they deal with their IP. Now, Warhammer Fantasy started as I want to say a twisted version of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, but calling it twisted isn't exactly a good description for it. Now, Lord of the Rings was a fantasy series made by Tolkien. And Tolkien, his whole thing was he wanted to make a fantasy universe based on the past of the British Isles. Basically, he looked at the mythological stories of other countries and other continents, and he wanted something similar for Great Britain. Now, he originally wrote Lord of the Rings, wrote it as a bedtime story that he would tell his kid, and he would work on the lore of it on his own. And his kid actually kept the story relatively consistent. He would correct his father whenever his father changed certain details of the story, and that caused him to actually write down the story itself. And as time went on, it became more of a mythological thing to him, and he wanted it published and shown to the world, and which is something he eventually did. What GW Games Workshop did is they wanted to take this universe as well as other fantasy universes and add their own little twist to it, making it their own, but making it distinctly something Warhammer. A world in which you could play tabletop games. These tabletop games made with little miniature figures that you would move a set amount distance based on the rules they made, and then you would roll with dice in order to determine who won certain combat. Now, Lord of the Rings would actually have a game like this made on it at some point as well, but Warhammer really started this genre of wartop games that were not nearly as deep as D&D. The wartime game setting in this would be a game that you would play for an hour or two, not something that you would do over the course of several months, but a single battle that would take place in this fantasy world. Now, one of the differences between Warhammer and Lord of the Rings, for example, was the dwarves. The dwarves in Warhammer Fantasy have something called the Grudge, where they hold a literal grudge against somebody, and they will hold this grudge against them for hundreds of years. They would write in their little book of grudges some minor slight that happened against them, and their descendants, their sons and their daughters, would hold on to this grudge for as long as it took to actually avenge it. Well, when this series started to become popular, they decide to make a parody of it, kinda, based on this setting, except in space and in the future. Now, in this setting, in Warhammer, what would happen is that it was 40,000 years in the future, and all the races from Warhammer Fantasy were transplanted into this new setting. For example, the dwarves became known as the squats, and the squats became like the same exact thing, uh, but in space and on motorcycles and technological creatures that, made technology that was better than all the other races in the universe. Oh boy, neighbors are home. Anyways, eventually this setting became more popular than Warhammer. And eventually Warhammer would be renamed to Warhammer Fantasy, whereas the future setting, Warhammer 40k, became the more popular setting. The steelier elements that were transplanted over from Warhammer Fantasy were then retconned away. For example, the squats were eventually determined to be killed by the Tyranids. And the Tyranids, after completely erasing this species of human, would go on to kind of like take their place, sorta. Not really. They weren't exactly like the space dwarves. But it became to the point where GW hated anything that came out of the original Warhammer 40k. And they influenced a bunch of forums and like chat groups to ban anybody who ever talked about the squats or any of the sillier elements that came from the original Warhammer 40k, which at the time was called Rogue Trader, based on the rogue traders in Warhammer 40k are people who are allowed to trade with anyone or any other race within the galaxy, even the races that would have you killed. Like if you traded with the Eldar, for example, or the Tau, you would be killed by the government of Warhammer 40k for basically dealing with aliens, whereas the rogue traders were allowed to do this because the Emperor of Mankind had determined long ago that sometimes it behooves these civilizations to actually get that some of the goods from these civilizations are necessary for humanity to survive. Therefore, there had to be some kind of group of individuals that were exempt from the normal rules of society. Anyways, where I'm going with all this is originally GW stole a bunch of intellectual property or copied it within fair use to make a kind of parody version of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. They then took this parody and made it into a serious series of fantasy lore that would eventually be made into books, a very advanced tabletop game, and to a video game series now known as Total War Warhammer. So they started with parody and made it into a serious setting. They then took that serious setting and made it into a parody of itself in space. But eventually that parody, it stopped being a parody and became another serious universe. Something that a lot of people nowadays will not admit to themselves, that Warhammer is not a parody universe. It is an absolutely 100% serious universe. And it's also one of those things where everyone always says that the Imperium of Man is a mid-century German type government, which it is not at all. It is more like I would say it's like more like an oligarchy, but planets within the Warhammer 40k universe are actually allowed to be republics or a democracy. As long as they pay their tithes, the Imperium doesn't care. As long as they pay their taxes, the Imperium will let any government be whatever, well, every planet be whatever type of government that they want to be. But anyways, GW has then gone on to like basically sue anybody that uses any part of the lore. This is including up until suing people for trying to use the term Warhammer. Now, the term Warhammer has been around for literally hundreds, if not thousands, of years as a tool of war. They tried to copyright the word Warhammer and then sue anybody who would use the word. Well, luckily for all of civilization, that lawsuit went through almost immediately. However, another thing GW has done has been to take anybody who's made free advertisement for the series, and I mean like fan animations, original content, stuff that like people watch on YouTube to actually like figure out the lore, and like people who make lore videos, people who make original content based on the setting, people who use like the likeness of the characters inside of Warhammer, and they have gone on to sue all these people and basically force them to work for GW or to stop entirely. In fact, a lot of the people who were making these animations were told to cease and desist, but they could come work for GW to make the stuff and be actually paid for it. And then they would have to sign a non-disclosure agreement and a non-compete clause. And a lot of these people eagerly signed on, hoping to get a job doing what they loved, making animations for GW and actually producing these videos, because they were basically just giving GW free advertisement. However, they would also, try to monetize these videos, which, to be fair, making an animation takes a lot of work, and they were doing this for free, so they would want to make at least some money on the advertisement for these animations. Well, GW made them basically sell their souls out for a non-disclosure and a non-compete, and these guys were waiting around for a long time, waiting for their invitation, their job offering. And GW never gave an offer to most of them. Some of them, like the creator of Astartes, for example, which you can still find on YouTube, being re-uploaded all the time by people who are very, very bitter about this whole situation. Well, a lot of these people were basically just shut up and were not allowed to continue making their fan animations, which annoyed a whole bunch of people within Warhammer 40k's fandom. Now, another thing that GW has done is that it has produced a lot of their figurines in China, which, if you're not aware, I've talked about this several times, is they use basically forced labor in China. And also, for their non-forced labor, they pay pennies, giving people barely a living wage within the country itself, so that GW can charge less for their figurines. However, GW always increases the price of their figurines to the point that basically this plastic, they no longer make it in pewter or other types of metal anymore like they used to, but this plastic is now worth its own weight in silver. And a lot of people have been frustrated with this to the point where we're starting to, I say we, but I haven't been doing it, where people have started to 3D print their own pieces, trying to basically bankrupt this company that made such an awesome setting in the first place. And honestly, I can't blame people for wanting to do that. how much GW has actually abused its fan base, and just absolutely frustrating to me. Just like how bad it's been for them, and how bad they've been treating their own customers. One of their one of the people who really has put a lot of effort into this setting is a guy called Arch Warhammer, and he was eventually given a cease and desist saying that he had to stop using the term Warhammer inside of his name, and now he just goes by Arch. And he interviewed a man named the Golden One, who I mentioned before. It's a whole thing where Arch interviewed this guy basically just to understand his anti-immigrant sentiment. And he didn't agree with the Golden One whatsoever, but since the Golden One is viewed as a mid-century German, Arch got wrapped up into this. And again, he just interviewed the guy because he wanted to understand his point of view. And he has said on multiple occasions that he doesn't really agree with his point of view, but he just wanted to be educated. And then an organization by the name of Sig Marxism, an actual socialist communist organization located on Reddit, went after him and tried to ruin his life, destroying his relationships with other 40K fans across the world, mostly on YouTube. Now, a lot of people still view Arch negatively, despite the fact that he has done nothing wrong. And Arch has just had to deal with it this entire time, including getting involved with a man that I really don't like by the name of Short Fat Otaku, also known as Dev. But it's because Dev was actually somewhat loyal to him that he kept Dev around. Now, Dev, being a very much anti-Trumper type person, is somebody who's gone relatively insane, and Arch has seen to kind of distance himself from him just quite a bit. Anyways, ignoring all of that history, GW still has people inside the organization that are not very happy with how things have been going. For example, Arch has contacts within GW that always tells him about all the BS that's going on inside the company. And GW either doesn't care or can't figure out who it is, because Arch is still being contacted by these insiders who will tell him all the crap that's been going on. So it must be someone relatively important who has laid low for quite a while, because this is the type of company that would fire any type of conservative inside of it. And again, it is very frustrating for me, because look, I have Warhammer stuff right here. Right here, I have new Warhammer stuff in Furnace Marines. I actually kind of like some of the new lore that's going on. I don't mind the Primaris Marines, but a lot of stuff that GW does makes me really not want to support them whatsoever. After all, look, I haven't even opened this thing. I haven't put together 40K figurines in quite a while or painted them. And my favorite chapter is the Lamenters chapter of all chapters. Shout out to all my Lamenters fans out there. Arch actually happens to be a huge fan of that chapter as well, and I think that is actually his home chapter. I don't know. He's a big Blood Angels fan, and the reason why I'm a Blood Angels fan is not because of Arch. It's because my brother was an Ultramarines fan, and he got me a book for the Blood Angels back when the Blood Angels had their own codex, or their own sub-codex, and that was all the way back in oh god, that had to be 3rd edition, man. I'm getting old. I'm 32 now, but god. Anyways, the whole point of this video is just how crappy it is to be involved in a fandom. Warhammer just for everything to be torn apart by a bunch of liberals inside the company who want to make it into their own thing and destroy anybody who even remotely tries to make something interesting having to do with the setting. Again, it relates to my thing with like Rick and Morty, where I'm hesitant to get into it, or in the Invincible show, because if I do, eventually I feel like I'm going to get backstabbed by the company, and I feel like I've wasted years and years of my life supporting something that eventually went so sour. But I mean, it is what it is. Eh, I think I'll leave this here before I get into like complete self-loathing or something like that. So just be aware of what kind of company GW is, guys, when you want to get into the series. Now, you can get into the series just fine, but it is what it is. Anyways, that's it for now. Bye.